interesting opportunity. I mean, again, I'm a dude who didn't go to college, so this kind of stuff, being able to sometimes do like a commencement speech. Sometimes there's like speaking gigs plus, and this is one of those where it's like, man, Lou Douglas, this is a pretty cool thing, and the guy has obviously, in hearing the description of services, really had this huge mark on this school. And it's put these waves out. I mean, when you think about successive generations of young men and women who have gone through this program and been influenced by, again, his impact. It allows you a little bit more intellectual room. So if you don't mind, I'm going to try some new ideas, some theories I've been working on. And to a certain extent, afterwards you can say it worked, it didn't work, but I'm going to use this opportunity. First and foremost, one of the most amazing, truly amazing experiments almost in the history of the world, seriously, was the land-grant university system. It was an amazing thing. This school is part of a network across the country because, again, this is going to be a little bit of a history thing, but again, I love history and I get pretty wrapped up in it, so I'm hoping to make it a little bit more exciting than just kind of a resuscitation of facts and stuff. But if you get your head around this, man, I mean, until like the 1800s, man, if you wanted to go to college, you had to be the son of a rich landowner. And you had to pretty much live on the East Coast. I mean, it was the Ivy League. And the Senator Morrill from Vermont came up with this idea of a land grant system. Let us, as a country, dedicate ourselves to creating a new generation of men and women, really the sons and daughters of farmers throughout the country. We're going to open up in every state a land-grant university. And at the center of that will be an agriculture school. Again, that was just an amazing leap in human history to make education available, affordable and available to the sons and daughters of working people. That in and of itself is something that really is important. That, where you're at, this school, the legacy of this system is really amazing. And now, up until about World War II, women and men came to these schools in America almost in equal numbers, 50-50. But after World War II ended, there was a thing called the GI Bill. To a certain extent, there was a covenant made with the men and women, but primarily men who fought in World War II, that when they came back, there was going to be free education, that they were going to really not have to necessarily go back. And I don't know if you all get a chance. I don't know how many of you all go down to Kansas City. But I think one of the most amazing emotional crossroads anywhere in America is in the parking lot of Union Station, the train station down there. When I started going there years ago, I've been to Kansas City a bunch. Excuse me. And the first time I went there, I was staying at the Westin right across the street. And the train station was old and derelict. And I was kind of drawn to it in a way. At one level, it's like, hey, man, look at the old train station, And I kind of walked over, and I was standing in the parking lot. All of a sudden, this dawned on me that, and if you get your head around this, World War I breaks out. And to a certain extent, America wanted to stay isolationist. They didn't really want to be involved in the European war. But when the Lusitania was sunk and America entered the war, from 3-4 states, young men and women, primarily men, but came to Kansas City literally in wagons, in Model Ts, to be dropped off to go to war. And you think about their parents, and this might be your great-grandparents, your grandparents. This was a generation of men and women who were literally one generation out of the Conestoga wagon, one generation off the boat. And they came and they just dragged themselves across America to end up in small farms throughout Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska. And if you think about that era, the sons that they brought to Union Station to drop off, when they left that family farm, and most family farms back then, there was a little cemetery where the kids who didn't survive childhood were buried. And if you think about this economy, and many of you all come from this culture, and we'll go back to this culture. Think about back then, sending your son or your sons off to war meant you had less people who were going to be able to bring in the crops. And this was your livelihood. This is how you made everything happen. The ability to bring in those crops meant the difference between, surviving or suffering through a winter. And this was big league ball to lead, the sons that had made it through diphtheria and rubella and 1,000 other diseases that killed young kids back then. But if you think about that departure, that moment, those hard people who didn't cry and weep, but they said in effect, good luck, son, make us proud, but come home, come back home. Imagine what it was like for them. There wasn't any kind of communication. There wasn't really phones. There were telegraphs and stuff like that, but they were gone, and they were gone for 4 years. But imagine the joy in that same parking lot when those doors swung back open and that generation of young men came back home. Again, here I was standing in the parking lot, and all of a sudden the realization of that, even though it was empty and derelict, it was like, wow, that energy, you can just still feel it, But that first generation, there used to be a song back then that went, how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? The idea was these young men and women went off to war, and they had been in Europe, and they had seen things well beyond what they could have imagined growing up in Kansas, in Nebraska, in Missouri. But that generation did what there wasn't a lot of latitude when you were part of that culture back then, because you pretty much did what your father did. In this society, men, you did what your father did. Women pretty much did what their mothers did. And there was kind of a rigid code, and they came back, and they went back to the farm. Now, what's interesting, the same thing happened a couple of years later when World War II broke out. This time, a surprising number of women, in fact, the city I live in, Washington, D.C., grew exponentially because as men went to war, women also went to war. And they came to Washington, D.C., and our city expanded greatly from women's participation. But this was interesting. When the door swung this time, that generation of men and women didn't go back to the farm. And that was a very interesting turn in America because, again, I mentioned earlier the GI Bill. Many of those young men and women went back to college. And it was a change in our country where we left the last vestiges of being a real agriculture, where the majority of people grew their own food and had a real direct connection to land. And even though it maybe isn't out when you get to West Kansas or even around here, but when you get to a lot of cities, what you see in the suburban area, that was all farmland that gave way to a rapidly changing America. All of a sudden there was a suburbia. But I want to come back to the land grants, because when the GI Bill kicked in and those young men came back and went to college, the role of women in our university system dropped dramatically. The enrollment rate. And women went from, again, almost 50-50 participants down to almost 10%. And up until about 1956, that's where it was, man. It was pretty much a man's system. But now it's interesting. I don't know about you or my mother, your grandmothers, they came back into the college system in the mid-1950s. But like my mom, she went back and she got her degree, but she married her college sweetheart, my dad, who still claims he was the big man on campus back then. They hooked up and they got married, and they moved out to suburbia and had me and 5 other kids. Now follow me for a second, please. My mother's generation stayed at home. Now they were educated women, strong women. They managed the books at home. They did the PTA. They had dinner on the table. They helped you with the homework. When my generation left home in the 70s, a very interesting thing happened in America. Up until then, we're here to talk a little bit about nonprofits and this kind of journey and the American nonprofit system. But up until about 1969, there was only about 50,000 nonprofits in America. It was the ones you kind of always heard. It was the YMCAs, it was the Salvation Armies, it was the Red Cross, many of them church-based. But what happened, it's interesting, and my mother's one of these people who all of a sudden when the kids left home, they looked at themselves and they looked at their life and they looked at their future. And they said, as much as I love being a mother, I can't allow the rest of my life to be defined by waiting for my husband, as much as I love him, to come home. I'm not going to sit there with a martini and slippers and have dinner on the table. It's my turn. And by the hundreds of thousands, this generation of women flooded into America to apply what they had learned and maybe postponed for a little bit. And they joined some of their sisters that had been banging away at the glass ceiling for a decade during the 1960s. But what's interesting is for a lot of those women, they looked out at the business world And they saw kind of a hostile environment. They saw a business environment that was very much a sexist environment. But they also saw one that they felt the skills I haven't really, I've been in business, I've been out of the workforce for 18 years. And they looked around at their communities and they saw homelessness, they saw domestic violence, they saw the civil rights movement. They saw these things and they said, you know, I want to be part of this. I want to be part of making my community whole. I want to be part of making my community better. And they started nonprofits. And we went from about, again, 50,000 nonprofits to almost 1 million in 10 years. Stay with me. What's interesting about this is this generation of women, when they came in with love in their hearts, they kind of brought with them our society's attitudes about women in general. Our country, and again, with respect, we've never been as good about acknowledging the contributions, the labor contributions of people of color and women. You know, to a certain extent, men went off and made money. They did business. That was good. Women stayed home and nurtured. You know, and it was kind of wrapped up in fuzziness and everything, and it never was evaluated as part of the economy. You know, it wasn't seen that being home with your kids was part of an equal contribution to the man's traditional role. It was kind of elevated. Men did this great hunter-gatherer stuff while women stayed home. And when they went out into the workforce with their new nonprofit ideas, they ran kind of smack dab into this notion of what our country expected of women. And the nonprofit sector grew, and we've grown tremendously, but to a certain extent, we never let go of that sense of being quiet, making do with what we have, to a certain extent, staying submissive. And I came into it, again, I don't know if you all read this, I don't think it's in my bio thing. I ran nightclubs. You know, I didn't want to start a nonprofit. All I ever wanted to do since I was 12 years old was, you know, please let me out of high school so I can go open the greatest nightclub in the world. That's all I wanted to do. College, keep college, man. You know, I was at Bob Dylan school. They can't teach you nothing in school you can't learn on the street. You know, and I was just ready to go. I want to open a nightclub. And that's what I did. I went out and I ran punk clubs in D.C. And again, it's a different era, but I mean, you know, got to book the Ramones, the first show they ever played in Washington, D.C. And I got to see amazing bands. I don't know, again, if you all know the D.C. thing, but the Bad Brains, Minor Threat, all kinds of them. It was a real fun ride. And I got to work with some of the great jazz legends, Sarah Vaughan, Oscar Peterson, Mel Torme. I had a really cool ride. And I was pretty much prepared to open my nightclub. I mean, I had worked at it. I approached it, quite frankly, like you all would your degree. You know, as much as I was having fun, like you all are, I was still studying. I had a goal. I wanted to open something that wasn't just going to be a flash in the pan, but something that was going to change the world. I got to be honest with you, man, I always thought that the power of music, theater, art, dance was a powerful medium. You know, that you could, if used properly, not just to make money, not just to have a good time, but again, to potentially get people to open up their minds and their hearts at the same time and say, you know, wow, this leads me to a new place. You got to understand, and again, I know you all oftentimes, you hear my generation talking, it's like, yeah, baby boomers, hippies, you're so cool. But I got to be honest with you, you know, there was a time in which the music that I grew up with when I was a young kid, like 10, 11, 12, it was an amazing thing to watch because, again, you all are used to it, but back then, even though America still has huge racial issues, you know, Motown brought people together, man. It had never happened before. People were dancing to the same music. So as a young kid who was intrigued already, it was like the power of music to bring races together. That's cool. I like that. You know, and as music changed, and I got to be honest with you, in the 1970s, disco might be fun now, but it sucked back then. I so hated disco. So when punk came along, it was like, oh man, now you're talking. Let's take it back. You know, young, loud, and snotty. Make it loud, make it fast. Let's get it on. And so for me, it was like this great, again, sense of experiment and the idea that anger could be power. That was a famous line by The Clash that I really was intrigued by. But again, just so you know, the DC Central Kitchen was not born out of me saying, I want to go out and feed the poor. I was just a volunteer. I'm going to knock over this plant. I'm going to keep my hands to myself. I don't know how many of you all have done volunteer work? Oh, see, we're going to talk about that later. But I oftentimes say, hello, my name is Robert, and I'm a recovering hypocrite. Because here I spent my entire youth talking about the power of music to change the world, but I was afraid to go out in my own community and get face-to-face with this growing number of homeless people. And how many of you have been to nation's capital, Washington, D.C.? wow, isn't it pretty freaky, though? Did you expect to see as many homeless people in front of the White House, in front of the Capitol? I mean, it's really still pretty disturbing. And like many people, I was like, gee, I feel sorry for those men and women, but I didn't know what I could do. And I got tricked into going out volunteering one night. And it was really one of those notions where I just asked, where's the food come from? And why on earth aren't we helping people in off the street? I work in a restaurant that throws away tons of food. You all are buying it. But the men and women we were serving were outside in the rain, waiting for this truck to pull up so that we could hand, we were inside this warm truck handing food out. And I'll be honest with you, these were decent people. But the point is we were getting the better end of the deal. And we weren't helping people in off the street or really solving the problem. We were just addressing a symptom. And I came back. I had no interest in being involved. I just came up with an idea that I thought would allow these churches, these men and women who had, to a certain extent, chosen this path, to just make the path a little bit less curvy, and invite more people, again, out of the rain and into a process where they could get the skills they needed to not be homeless or hungry anymore. But this was one of those moments, and young brothers and sisters, I bring this up for a purpose, because a lot of what you're going to encounter in your own path is that same sense of wanting to do something a little bit different, wanting to push the envelope a little bit, having a new idea. And like me, you're going to no doubt run into people who give you all the reasons it won't work. You can't do it. And the real challenge is having, again, sometimes the courage and the networks to make it happen. Now, I'm really interested in this, and I'm going to sidebar for a second, just because I got to ask. I read a lot. I still read a lot about history. I'm fascinated by liberation movements. Has anybody heard of Thomas Clarkson, 1800s? I had never heard of this guy either, but I want to bring this up because I think it's really germane for our conversation today. Thomas Clarkson, this was like and I'm really just grabbing at numbers. It's like 1880. No, actually 1780. And he was a student at Oxford University. And back then, Oxford every year, not unlike the Lou Douglas lecture series, Oxford every year had a Latin essay contest. And if you won the Latin essay contest, you were made. I mean, literally, it was write your own ticket. No matter what job you wanted, if you were the winner, you could pick any job, literally. So Thomas Clarkson was just a student, just like any of you, who set his sights on this. He just wanted to win the prize. Interestingly enough, some American Quakers had been traveling around England at the time talking about a concept called abolition. And they had caught the ear of the dean of Oxford. And to throw a curveball into this year's Latin essay contest, he made the subject, is it wrong to enslave a man against his will? Now, Thomas Clarkson, all he wanted to do was win the prize, because it was basically a shortcut to riches. And he studied, he worked and studied, and he won. And on the way down to London to take up his new post, he stopped by a place called Wade's Mill. And again, I had never heard this story. I just read this recently, and it just completely floored me. Because he got off his horse at Wade's Mill, and he started walking around. And he's like, how did this happen? It's like, I just wanted to win the prize. This knowledge had seeped from his brain down to his heart and into his soul. And he was just stuck. He couldn't take the job. He knew he had to do something. Now get this, this guy is a college grad. And think about what he was going up against. Only men who owned property, 1 in 9 men could vote in England at the time. Every member of parliament, literally every single member, had a financial stake in the slave trade. The slave trade, by the way, went from northern Africa to Jamaica to England. This was kind of insidious triangular route. But again, every single member of parliament, the King of England had a stake in the slave trade. The Church of England had a stake in the slave trade. In most of those port cities, a new emerging industry, insurance, all those companies that were insuring the goods and all the rum and all the stuff that was going to come back, they had a stake. That's what he went up against. One person, one guy. And what he did by himself, when he got back on his horse, he launched the modern human rights movement. You've probably all seen a woodcut, famous woodcut that shows the design in which slaves were positioned in a slave ship. You've all seen that picture? That was him. And that was what's considered almost one of the first examples of investigative journalism. You know, he was going to say to England, look at this. This is us. This is our country. Is that the country you want? Is that what you want to be a part of? He organized school children to do a sugar boycott. And I guarantee you, brothers and sisters, sugar was like crack cocaine back then. You know, I mean, think about it. Think about the average diet. Man, the more sugar you can put on that shit, I mean, it was good. You know, sugar was important back then. Because up until then, it was like salt or pepper. You know, so sugar was a big deal. So for school children to get their heads around the idea that they wanted to be part of a new England. But it took him 40 years. And again, he built coalitions. But he never, ever accepted the notion that he couldn't change the world, that he couldn't be part of something bigger, that he didn't have the power. Similarly, and I'm going to jump a little bit back to America, one of my favorite Americans, and I got a long list of people I think are really cool, but Harriet Tubman, everybody know about Harriet Tubman? You know what's crazy about Harriet Tubman that I had no idea? She was like 4'10" and didn't even weigh 100 pounds. Is it you? Oh, seriously, stand up, little sister. Stand up, if you don't mind. That's Harriet Tubman, you know? But I mean, think about this. Here's a woman, again, think about this. You know, oftentimes we equate change and courage with size, you know? And the notion that Harriet Tubman went down, and again, make no mistake, when she crossed that Mason-Dixon line and she went into the South, they would have hung her like that if they caught her. Just like that, you know? And here she is walking around. She's got a big-ass gun strapped to her side, too. Probably weighed half of what she did. But again, to really get your head around that, again, afterwards, what's your name, little sister? Oh, big sister, sorry. I'm sorry. What's your name? Amber. Everybody, when you were done, man, go check out Amber. I mean, you know, and just imagine, man, you know. But that's the kind of thing that fascinates me. You know, who says that you can't change the world? You know, who says that, you know, a bartender guy who barely graduated high school can't call a nonprofit Congress? I mean, nobody elected me to nothing. You know, I went to India because I had read in a book, again, another one of these little historic footnotes. I read in this book that, and again, I'm just reading, cruising along, reading about Indian independence, Gandhi, you know, and all of a sudden I see this little teeny footnote that said that the British never, ever had more than 3,000 officers stationed in India. And I stopped and it's like, whoa, 3,000 white dudes, 350 million people, an entire subcontinent, century and a half, how on earth? And again, my father was in the service, so you know you get basic command structure, but still, 3,000 men were able to dominate 350 million? Seriously, how'd that work? So I went to study. I figured this would be a great excuse for a road trip. I mean, I've never been to India. Sounds good, so I went. And I really thought it would take me a lot of like serious, you know, investigative journalism stuff. You know, and I went really expecting to spend some time. And it took me about literally less than an hour. I was walking through Nehru's home. Oh, I'm so serious, it's embarrassing. And it made me laugh out loud. Because here I was in this guy, the first prime minister's home, which they've converted in kind of a museum study center. And I'm walking around thinking that this has got to be some kind of serious Da Vinci Code kind of plot, you know? And all of a sudden I realized, it's like, oh my God, as long as the British could keep Indians divided by race, caste, geography, language, and squabbling and fighting with each other, it was easy. What made me laugh was that was the nonprofit sector in America. You know, how could something that it was employing tens of thousands of educated women, just like my mother, how could they have somehow got on this road where instead of fighting a common enemy, they were fighting each other for chump change? Chump change, you know? They had gotten, somehow we got so divided. And again, I started to really go back, and this is where the beginning of this discussions began. This sense of this giant wave, this amazing wave of women who came in to change the world. What happened? Where did we go? How did we get on this path where instead of being kind of agents of liberation, and I don't mean in some kind of 1960s, you know, let's burn the place down kind of liberation, but a sense of like liberation of the mind. You know, liberation of our society, liberation of commerce. You know, how did we get trapped in this notion of like, hey, if you write me a check, at the end of the year, I'll go away, and where did we think that somehow we could make homelessness disappear that way? Again, I say this all the time, the word homeless, and there's no wrong answers here, but anybody, if you're homeless in America, what are some of the reasons you might be homeless in America? Anybody? What's that? Healthcare, there you go. Yeah, man, I think you said crackhead first, and that's cool, but yeah, man. Seriously, I get good ears, bro. I've been in bars and bars all my life. I can hear that shit, So anyway, substance abuse, healthcare, what else? Unemployment. No money. Not educated. Natural disasters. Mental health. Price of real estate, just housing and stuff. Now, again, think about this. Go back and again. Somehow, we started using this word. And instead of having serious conversations, because again, none of these things you mentioned, and 100 other things, domestic violence, prison, none of these things are going to magically disappear unless we have a serious conversation. Seriously, it's just not going to, just ignoring it isn't going to make things any better. And just kind of batching all these crazy social issues under some fuzzy words like homelessness and then raising money off it. How did we get down this road? And that's kind of the reason I'm on this journey. When I came back from India, I said, in effect, okay, again, now that I kind of see why not that we're divided and fighting one another, what can we do? And again, I'm just one dude. Granted, I've had luck. I've had a lot of people come and visit the DC Central Kitchen, and I think we've been able to pave the way for some very new, bold ideas about social entrepreneurship, microcredit, employing people. We pushed a lot of envelopes, but I'm interested in the whole enchilada, man. I'm not interested in feeding poor people. I'm interested in changing the world. That's why, when I started out with my nightclub, man, that was my goal. And I didn't give that up just so I could feed the poor. But I started thinking, how can we actually get back on this right track? How can we, in effect, liberate the movement and really go back to where we might have begun, 30 years ago? And I say this, young brothers and sisters, not so I can entertain you, not to try and make this about some kind of History 101 class, but I want to speak to you, serious, man, grown up to grown up. And I got to be honest with you, man. I started out talking about World War I, World War II. Those young men and women were younger than you are right now when they went. It's very tempting, and I'm totally hip to the idea that you will say, in effect, when I grow up, whatever. The reality is, brothers and sisters, you're grown up. You're adults. And you got to really get your head around this world, because this is your life I'm talking about here. This is your future, and this is not Little League ball. My generation was lucky, real lucky, because I came up in a time where we could ignore these issues. We could pretend they didn't exist. We could think that you could write a check and somehow magically somebody else would fix it without a larger conversation. And I wish it wasn't true, brothers and sisters, but I'm here just to be honest with you, because the reality is the world's shifting, it's shifting fast. My generation, I know as much as you wish that we'd all suddenly die on the same day and disappear. The reality is the baby boomers are just starting to get old. And there's 80 million people. Now, I was here earlier, and I started this week out in Topeka, which, by the way, man, I was Sunday afternoon in Topeka. Well, that was a tough ride, man. I thought, I'm pretty good at finding something to do in a town. I was stumped. I went back to the hotel and said, okay, man, can I paint the place while I'm here? Anything, please, keep me busy. But the point is, I was there to speak with members of the Meals on Wheels community of this state. And the reality is, in America right now, everybody knows Meals on Wheels, right? 50% of American cities have a waiting list. That means there's older Americans, people who fought in World War II, civil rights heroes, people who made this university happen, built the highways, people who built the farm system in America, people we owe a debt of gratitude that is going to be impossible to repay. Those men and women, 50% of American cities have those men and women waiting in a list for some kind of meals right now. And there's 80 million people about to get old. 80 million people. This state and just about every state's budget is about 1/4 Medicaid, Medicare. And again, there's 80 million people coming up. Who's going to pay those taxes? Who's going to have to make that bill come, when the bill comes through? Who's going to have to pay for that? You, your generation. So this is you. This is your life. This is your future. And at the same time, and again, I'm totally hip. I totally understand that many of you all have every right to assume that once you graduate from this school, that America will somehow produce for you a job that will allow you to buy a home, have a vacation, get a car, and put your kids through school. And to a certain extent, we've all grown up in America assuming that, hey, man, this is America. Man, we're on top. But the reality is, after World War II, when we began the GI Bill, the reality is the rest of the world was completely in ashes. We literally had the last industrial base, on the planet. And as you all know, sons and daughters, granddaughters of farmers of Kansas, we turned from tanks to tractors, to threshers, and to 1,000 other tools that allowed us to produce one of the greatest farm systems the planet's ever seen. And it's taken about 60 years, but the point is the rest of the world has just caught up. And there's young men and women in China, and in India, and in Brazil, and a bunch of other countries, man, and they've caught up, and they want it just as bad as you do. They're waiting for their piece of the pie. And we're going to have to compete in a global economy literally like we've never had to compete in a long, long time. And again, so as you all go out in the world, you're going to be expected to pay for my generation. We're going to have to continue to pay for the war we're in. And we're going to have to pay for it with an economy in which there's a lot of jobs. We're going to leave this country. So I urge you, whether you choose to go into nonprofits, and I don't think you have to necessarily make a choice. Just show of hands. How many of you are interested in working in a nonprofit organization? Just show of hands. How many of you all want to go out there and make some money? You can do both. You can do both. They're not mutually exclusive. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. The old school said you could either go out and make money and then maybe someday give a little bit back. And by the way, if you think about philanthropy in America, it was all built on this kind of Carnegie Rockefeller thing. And the model says, I'm going to make a bunch of money in my life, and somewhere near the end of my life, I'm going to give a little back trying to offset the damage I did making a bunch of money in my life. And no one's ever stopped and said, dude, that'll never work. So what I'm hoping we can talk about today, tomorrow, whenever you want, is that sense of what does it look like in the future? How do you actually contribute to your society in the way the traditional nonprofit system has, but how do you do it in a way that allows you to make a living and allow you to maybe pay somebody a living wage and potentially even use local resources? One of the reasons I'm here, right here at this university, is because I started out talking about the land grants. And I believe land grants, and in particular, for those of you all in the agriculture school, the state extension system. Everybody know what the extension system is? You all have grown up in a farm state. To me, it's one of the most amazing existing resources. Just so you know, man, that's my entire bag. There's nothing that I don't have to build anything, buy anything. My whole thing is whatever we need is already there. The DC Central Kitchen, I get way too much credit, man. All it is I just took food we were throwing away, people, our society, were literally throwing away, a kitchen that was just sitting there, a generation of young men and women. How many of you all had done community service? Well, I already asked that. But the point is, your generation, man, think about this. 90% of the freshman class in most universities have done community service. What an amazing asset that is. But I also was really lucky, man. A few years ago, I don't know how many of you all have ever heard of Muhammad Yunus, who started the Green Bank in Bangladesh, just won the Nobel Peace Prize. I can't believe, man, this guy has become my Mick Jagger. Seriously, man, this guy is like totally, and I'm really lucky. We're on the same board. In fact, I'm the chairman of the board that he's on, so I can actually boss his ass around if I want to, How cool is that, But the point is, listen to this. This guy was an American-trained economist, and he went back home to Bangladesh. Now, for those of you who pay attention to world politics, man, Bangladesh has always been, since it was born after the British split, always been one of the poorest countries on the planet. It's always been hardcore poor. But it's his home, man, and he loves his country like you all probably love your town, your state, your cities. But he went back, and at one point, some women who were almost indentured to moneylenders in this village. And he asked them, what would it take for you to be free of them? And they went over and huddled, and I'm kind of shortening this story, but they went over and he came back, and they said, $27. And he's like, wow, I've got that in my pocket right now. And I guess I could give it to them, But you know what, man, that's charity, you know? And I'm interested in an economic tool. How about if I'll tell you what, I'll loan you the money. I'll loan you the money and you start a business and you pay me back over time, developing the business that will mean you'll never have to go back to the moneylender again. And this dude has elevated 100 million, primarily women, out of poverty with loans. The power of the economy, the power of money. Again, money made with the expectation of repayment. Not with this, oh, I'd love to loan you the money, but you're just a poor, illiterate woman, and you could never repay me. You know, his whole experiment is, no matter how low people are, there's always going to be a spirit of entrepreneurialism. There's a deep willingness to own their own life. And shame on anybody, even if it's a nonprofit done in the name of love, that doesn't help that person discover that in themselves, rise up and own their own life. And to me, that is such a radical, different concept than charity in America. And I'm just totally excited by this notion. And I hope you all will get your head around this, and particularly those of you all who want to make money, because I know that's got to be a driver for you, man. You got to pay back student loans. You know, some of you all have some credit card debt. You know, some of you all have parents that just are basically going to nag you until you get a job that pays some kind of salary that means you can basically get out of their house. Whatever. There's nothing wrong with wanting to make money. But the point is, you can do it in a way that not only allows you to make a living, but you can do it in a way, again, that almost makes the way you make your money your philanthropy. I'm a big believer in this. We can't charity our way out of this anymore. We can't think that at the end of the year a check will do it. I'm really interested, though, in could it be as simple as the way you spend your money every day? Again, I'm going to throw a little bit more history, but you all have no doubt read, particularly about Dr. King, since we made, we really have a day in honor of his memory. You've read about Mahatma Gandhi, you've read about Dr. King, and some of you all have even read about Cesar Chavez. I'm fascinated by these three men. Now, you got to understand, these were not, this whole idea of Dr. King the saint, I got to be honest, man, all these men were men. They were flawed human beings like we all are. But I'm interested in them as tacticians. And what's fascinating about all three of these men, if you'll just hang with me for a second, is if you read the history of how they kind of elevated and got people to rise up, they were basically saying to poor people, again, just like Eunice did, Eunice does, and I hope like I am at the Central Kitchen, they're saying in effect, no matter how far down you are, and no matter how big the foe or the obstacle looks, again, think of Thomas Clarkson going up against the King of England, the Church of England, Parliament, the entire power structure. No matter how big it is, oftentimes that power is an illusion. And what Dr. King said, in effect, is if we don't ride the bus, all of us, even though it only costs a dime to ride the bus, those dimes will add up, and there'll be an economic impact. And if we do it together, it will work. And he based that on the fact that Gandhi had done the same thing with salt. You know, you could walk down to the beach in India, and just to pick up salt off the ground was illegal. You had to buy salt that was brought in from England. Now again, Gandhi said, hey, look, man, it's illegal, but look, there's 350 million of us. They can't put us all in jail. And if we all don't buy it, it will add up. He also used the camel. There's a famous picture of him when he walked down to this port city of Dundee and picked up a handful of salt. He's surrounded by women and untouchables, men and women who were normally never included in the decision-making process. Because he was saying, in effect, look, man, they've kept us divided. But the reality is, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, rich, poor, north, south, whatever shade of brown you is, the point is, salt is an essential. In this climate, salt is essential to life. What we're doing keeps us all down. We are all Indians. It was a profoundly amazing statement to think that you could lead a social movement with a handful of salt. But what's interesting about those, and Cesar Chavez eventually did the same thing with grapes and the grape boycott, which, by the way, in the late 60s was led by college students at this university and all across America, like the young men and women who boycotted sugar in England. Young men and women led in the grape boycott all across America. But what's fascinating is all three men, while they were devout men, and all three see, and we hear a lot about their adherence to nonviolence. Ultimately, though, when you get down to it, the whole idea of a boycott is kind of a punishing thing. It's intended to inflict harm. And I must admit, as a young man, I was kind of intrigued about, I don't get it. I mean, it sounds kind of violent to me. But who am I to question, King Chavez and, Gandhi. But at the end of the day, what could have been interesting, and I think what maybe could open a door for your generation, and again, to you all who want to make money, at the end of the day, wouldn't it have been interesting if they had said, in effect, okay, now that we know our collective power and that our pennies have power, let's flip the boycott to the idea of a boycott. Let's make sure that every penny we spend drives the point that we want more. We're not going to settle for what you want to give us. We're going to tell you what we're willing to buy. So it in effect says, not only do I want that cup of fair trade coffee when I go to the student union, but I want to make sure, and I know I'm picking on the university, but I want to make sure that if you have an employee here, that the lowest paid employee still gets a living wage and has health care, and has a retirement option. Because that's my choice. I can choose. I hope it wasn't something I said. No? Okay. She doesn't work for fair trade. No. I'm just busting on your little sister. Anyway. But you get my point. When you walk down that main street in town, and I don't know how many of you are, you probably all go over to Aggieville or whatever it's called, but you go down to the main drag in town. Yesterday I was at this new restaurant, V. You see this new restaurant, Italian restaurant down? And there's an art gallery across the street, and I had dinner tonight at Harry's. But all three of these are locally owned stores. And in the new restaurant, V, when I asked them about their menu, and I said, hey, man, do you purchase local foods? And they said, yeah, man, virtually everything we serve here is local. And it's like, man, dude, you got to put that on your menu. You got to let people know when they come in here and buy a dinner, they're not just getting a great dinner. They're helping a local farmer stay solvent. And that's the future. That's the power you have. I always say, man, the future is not more nonprofits, even though I love what I do. And the future isn't nonprofits run like business, although you can make a case that that's a pretty cool thing. I'm interested in business being run like nonprofits. And I think there's a cool way in which that could be open up an entire new door to a whole different level of commerce that, again, makes sure that you all don't have to choose in the future between, your kid and their education, and you don't have to say, in effect, well, I got to write a check to make sure that somebody can come and deliver Meals on Wheels tomorrow, or make sure the food pantry stays open, make sure the domestic violence shelter is still there, or make sure the new homeless shelter, we have to build a new one now because the one that was 50 beds is too small now. You don't want to have to make those choices because it's going to be tough, a tougher economy. So anyway, this is all the kind of things that I'm thinking about. And I urge you, and again, I'm looking out at the audience and I see some people basically saying, when is he going to be done so I can go back to what I was doing because I'm just getting credit for listening to this guy talk. And some of you are probably thinking, I kind of get it, but, he's been from this guy Thomas Clarkson to Gandhi to King. He's just all, I don't know. The point I'm trying to make is history is full of examples. And Lou Douglas is an example, of the power an individual has to change the world. But it's not done by other people over there. It's not done by these giant heroes. It's done by regular people, just like you, who basically say, in effect, I'm going to make a choice in my life, a conscious choice about how I'm going to live, how much money I'm going to make, what kind of neighbor I'm going to be. You have a huge amount of power. You really do. But I just urge you to recognize that as a generation, man, this world's changing fast. Really, really fast. And you have to own every day of your life, man. The idea when you walk through this town, many of you all think, look, man, I'm just going to college here. This isn't my town. It's your town. You live here. Own every single day. Make this your town. No matter where you go, own that city. Understand that city. Get into that city. Again, I travel all over. I'm really lucky. But it's rare that I walk around town where I'm not just cruising around town. I'm looking at the local paper. I'm looking at billboards, what bands are playing, what books are in the book, what books are moving in the bookstore. I'm listening to conversations. I'm not creepy, but you know what I mean? I'm listening to conversations like in the books, and when I'm in the coffee shops. What's this town about? What's the history of this town? What's the future of this town? Who's the mayor of this town? What's going on either end of town where they're digging it up and there's nothing there? I want to know this stuff. But the point is, you should too. No matter where you go, own your life. And I'm going to give you two real quick, before we close it up. I'm not here, by the way. Two very quick bits of advice. First one. Many of you all, how many of you all are freshmen? Just here. Oh, that explains why you're here. And they totally made you come here tonight, didn't you? Okay, here's the deal. Many of you all left best friends back home. People who you grew up with, people who you talked when you didn't know S from S. People who were there for you when you were down, and you've moved on in your life. And you're going to make new friends here. But one of the most important bits of advice I can give you is the stuff we talked about tonight, making change, or just honest to goodness, just life in general. It's a ride, brothers and sisters. It's up and down all the time. You never know what's going to turn. You're going to need friends. Never assume, ever, that your friends, no matter how intense they are and how much you've been through, that they will stay, deep and meaningful unless you work at it. I tell you, man, again, this sounds kind of cynical in a way, but life conspires to pull the passion out of you. And sometimes, no matter how passionate you might fall in love with somebody, no matter how deep your friendships might be, and no matter how cool that job might be the first day you get it and you're like, I can't believe I got the coolest job in the world, unless you work at it every single day and try and keep it alive, keep it fresh. So, the friends you make now and some of the friends you left behind are going to be the best friends you've ever had in your life, and you're going to need them. There's going to be days, I tell you, when I call people up and it's like, oh, please tell me I was a cool guy. I feel like such a jerk now. Tell me, remind me of what I believed in. Remind me how passionate I was so I can go back in. Remember to write to those friends and keep those friendships alive. Again, it's a real commitment, but I urge you to do it because those friends and the friends you make in school will be some of the best friends you'll ever have in your life. And the second bit of advice is, man, rock hard. I'm so serious, man. Don't let anybody tell you, keep it quiet, slow down, you move too fast, it can't happen that way, it's never been done. Man, it's your life. It's your life, you own it. Own it, man, go for it. Don't let anybody tell you to slow down. Again, don't be jerks, and don't be rude, but again, believe in yourselves and believe in the dreams and passions you have now. Hold on to those. Because it's important, and the world needs you more than you know, seriously. So on that note, thank you all very much for this opportunity, and we'll do some questions.